Um, well, thank you very much for the intro, and I really appreciate being here. I really appreciate being here. I think what is one of the things that has been a very interesting connection between both of the, I'll say both, I don't want to say both cultures, because I don't really think that it's necessarily that kind of separation. I have been lucky enough to encounter works from Brazil, and of course my area of specialty is in Jamaica. But I think one of the things that has been interesting has been the recasting of a narrative, and the recasting of a narrative from a particular perspective. The artists that we were able to work from Jamaica here are what we call Jamaican intuitive artists. So they're artists who, in other countries in the world, okay, sorry, in other countries in the world, their work may be termed as naive or primitive. We don't use that term in Jamaica because we find those terms to be particularly problematic, especially when you are speaking about a nation of primarily people of African descent. So we use the term intuitive because we feel that the works have a connection despite all of the trials of the period of enslavement with our African heritage. So in the works that you see are works that express spiritual practice and a unique spiritual belief structure, which is what I think is the connection between the two bodies of work, so to speak, because I don't know if anybody here is seeing the works of Albert Artwell or Everald Brown. They have interpreted and reinterpreted what you would say European Christian belief structures to really embody their lived experiences, but their lived experiences, and particularly their experiences as people of color, as Black people. So I think that in that respect, that's where we have that connection. I mean, there are other connections between us and Brazil. I mean, points of common origin, obviously. But I think that there has always been cultural transmission between both Brazil and Jamaica, some in more obvious ways than others. But that in terms of particularly, I guess, in music. But the connections exist also within artistic practice in that those, I mean, I think the exploration and the connections are being made more obvious in this exhibition than ever before, but that's what I see as the connecting factors, you know, the drive to not accept the drive to not accept the narrative that was created and presented for us as a people, and the impetus to understand that we have the power to recreate our realities.
I think it's important that you're highlighting this interconnections through very, I would say, unexpected points such as spirituality. Because walking through the exhibition, that's not what might jump at you in the first case, but when you understand or kind of engage with the practice of the individual artist, then it becomes very strong, this aspect of, you know, trying to look at spirituality, which in many ways might be opposed to what you're seeing, or like, you know, monotheistic religions being opposed to what the artists are trying to show in their work, but while being very much involved and inspired by, you know, the syncretic religious practices that they believe in or that they're holding on to.
And I just want to add one thing. The term intuitive was coined by the National Gallery's first chief curator, David Boxer. And one of the main reasons he used the term intuitive was because he felt that, I mean, I have to give a little bit of context. During the period of enslavement in Jamaica, there was an active drive to destroy anything that could have been deemed as visual artistic practice. So a lot of works that were created by the enslaved were destroyed because they were trying to wipe out aspects of our culture. And yet 20th century artists were producing works that harkened back to African artistic practices, and he felt that the reason he used the term intuitive, coming from intuition, was he actually felt that there was somehow a connection with a collective consciousness. And that's what I believe is also something that is a connecting factor.
Speaking of collective consciousness, I would like to move to you, Virat. Your piece in the Reader is called "Movements of Justice and Joy," and I love the first paragraph of this essay because you evoke, the carnivals that happen in very many different spaces of the world, and you name a few of those spaces. And find like a connecting factor and take that as a point of departure to explore how black radical organizing can look like, both as a space of joy but also as a space of struggle and engagement with oppression. So maybe you can just give us a sense of why you felt that Carnival was such a befitting or characteristic point of departure for engaging with the duality of, on the one hand, fighting against oppression, on the other hand, actually celebrating, culture, celebrating existence, celebrating our positionalities as people of the African diaspora all across the world.
It's a really, really big question, right? Just let me start by saying thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's an honor to sit with you all here. So that point of departure is informed by and inspired by having multiple diasporic cultures living inside of my body. Being born in Sierra Leone, but growing up as a black immigrant in a black country in Jamaica in the Caribbean, and then moving to the United States, and then developing an understanding, an embodied understanding of what it is to be a Black American. These are three different cultures, right? Post-colonial, Anglo-colonial cultures. And when I'm with these different cultures, there are differences in how we communicate. There are differences in politically what we are motivated by, because that is, of course, informed by the geographies and the specific histories of those geographies. I also have yearned to find the connection between and to sort of find a way to reconcile those differences, because the peoples of these different spaces don't always agree, right, within the diaspora. And so therefore, different embodied gestural ways of memory and remembering a more collective kind of being and behavior and way of being in the world, a continued way of being in the world, is of deep interest in my work and in my research. And so thinking about that gesturally, and I include food in that, I include music in that, I include dance, right? Facial expressions, stances, everyday gestures. That is what motivated that first paragraph, to think about the season that we're in right now, which is the late winter into spring into summer. Is a season all over the world, not just in English, but in all of the colonial languages and our own dialectic languages that celebrate mass culture, masquerade, carnival culture, right? So reaching back into old tribal dances, ritual ceremonies that harken back to various countries and regions of the continent, right? But also what has developed since the transatlantic slave trade in all of the different areas of the diaspora around the world. And in Brazil in particular, right? There are so many carnivals and masquerade dances and ceremonies that are held by societies, by clubs, by groups. And it's very similar aesthetically, musically, sonically, in movement to what we see in Carnival in Jamaica, in Carnival in Sierra Leone, where we have the deboons come out into the street and dance and dress in the costumes and the mask work and the colors, the materiality, the textures, the use of raffia and wood and, all of these artistic expressions that hold, what I think is a collective retention of ourselves, of our various selves, because there isn't a one self.
And another thing that your text got me thinking about was, organizing. Because the second part of the title is movements of justice and joy, Black radical organizing and solidarity across difference. And I think this subtitle really signaled, or even your text itself, really signaled how the role of organizing in these communities. And I know that for organizing, you need language. You need to, speak to each other, to connect to each other. And at the same time, there are all of these language barriers, right? So in not even within the diaspora, but also, within the continent, within the individual country, in so many languages. So how do we reach that difference while being in solidarity, which is reading your subtitle? And how does the gestural play a part in that? Because I found that to be very interesting, because there are some gestures like this, thanks to TikTok and all of these online formats. You have these videos where you have two Africans basically saying how someone would gesture at a certain thing in their specific culture. And you see that across very different cultures, the gestures are the same, right? So people would understand this gesture in so many different places. And so what role does the gesture play in communicating that then leads to organizing around common causes and around, cultural matters?
I find this kind of questioning very exciting. It really is exciting, because it fills me with constant fascination, the kind of secrecy and code that happens inside of gesture across languages. And it happens within a single country, not just from one nation to the next, but within several languages that are happening in the country. But when we think about different kinds of gazes, different kinds of looks that you can do, and sounds that you can make, that can create a kind of recognition between people who may not share English or Dutch or Portuguese, or they don't share these languages, but they can find each other through these stances and through these facial expressions, through these non-verbal soundings. That can create the first kind of active collectivity that you can build a movement around, and build a sort of a common finding of what you need in order to make your life better as a community within the space that you find yourself, right? So I spend a lot of time studying this, but also spend a lot of time just noticing it, right? So we just had a conversation about this out in the sun earlier, about talking about traveling and noticing another person from the diaspora. We don't share a history, we don't share a culture, but there's a way that we look at each other and the way that we walk past each other, that all of a sudden it's a reunion of a long-lost friend that you don't know, is a total stranger, right? I find this also in food, in terms of how you can anchor into a sense of safety, even though you are walking with a certain kind of illegibility in a space. You can still find grounding and home in a space through these stances, or through smells. I had this experience in Brazil when I went there. The first time I went there, I was walking around trying to find food in Salvador, and I could smell palm oil. I smelled palm oil and followed my nose and found a tent with a woman selling acarajé, which in Sierra Leone we call akara. I have never smelled palm oil outside of my mother's kitchen, ever, not even in a restaurant. But I fly to Brazil for the first time in my life, and I walk around and I saw this and I smelled it and I bought this food, and I don't speak Portuguese. And I was like, hey, you have akara? We have akara in Sierra Leone. And that was enough for us to converse. I sat with her for 2 hours. And this is the proof to me that there is a code that we can plug into, even though we don't share the same dominant language.
The Black Cinema Collective and the work that you do in Seattle also was very interesting in regards to how it ties back to this, community organizing on a local, micro-local, macro-local level, to kind of do something cultural for the community and kind of create this sense of community maybe in the first place. Because if people move we know that the luxury of selecting a place to live is becoming more and more difficult. I think everywhere, Berliners in the space know this. So you can't really just choose your address. You end up living in spaces dictated by your race, your class, your gender, your status of employment, and so on. So could you maybe share a bit about the work that you do there, and also how you locate yourselves in terms of not just real estate, but also beyond that, in terms of gentrification threatening the ability to be able to own space in that sense, but then still being able to find a way of manufacturing ownership that goes beyond buying and selling, being resident or being present, or hosting events of people being comfortable in that space. So maybe share a bit about that work.
My goodness, another big question. I'm going to open up the answer a little bit to include a recent project, just because of how you're framing this about choosing space and about all of the different things that impact the choice or lack of choice in space. I just finished a project called Untitled in Seattle, Washington, in the US, that was engaging, well, it was a partnership where the framework was specifically non-hierarchical, where I brought together community activists, community organizers, as well as different disciplinary artists, performers, visual artists, poets, architects, musicians, to make a work together that interrogated the problem with gentrification, right, and displacement of communities, and specifically the displacement of cultural spaces for people to gather safely, where they can find each other and recognize each other, right? And so that work, it relates back to the work I'm doing with Black Cinema Collective, which is the effort to create that as well, to save cultural space so that people can find themselves inside of it, share films that are focused on Afro-diasporic filmmakers from around the world. So we do screenings, we do discussions, we do community gatherings that celebrate storytellers who come from different language spaces and different geographies within the Black diaspora. And the reason for this is part of the mission of that is not just to create space for the few Black people there are in Washington to gather safely to see stories, but also to see stories beyond their immediate environs, right? Because of my background, again, it's going to influence this desire to make sure that people see that we have so many stories, an ocean of stories that make up Afro-diasporic life. And that is not just African American stories. I want African Americans to see Caribbean filmmakers and South American filmmakers, that's right. And filmmakers who are immigrants for different reasons, or from refugee communities who are throughout Europe or in South Asia. We have a multicultural group that runs Black Cinema Collective, and we try to find Black people within these spaces in Guatemala, in India, and find those films and bring them to the screen so that people see stories from many of us.
Thank you so much. I'd like to move on to Eliza and ask about the work that you do with Ipeafro. When Paz, one of the curators of the show, initially, so we're looking at text, we're looking at historical text, doing our research, trying to find a way to shape the publication into what it eventually became. And her answer to almost every query was always like, Ipeafro. Ipeafro will help us find it. Ipeafro has it. Ipeafro will give us the loan for the artwork. Ipeafro will give us the rights for the text you want to republish. So it was initially a mystery to me how one institution, an institute, could do all of this work, on a visual arts level, on an archival level, and all of that. So maybe just give us a sense about the kind of institution that Ipeafro is, the kind of work that you do across all of these different disciplines, and also maybe a bit of historical context when it was founded and how it came into being as an institution.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation for me to be here with this marvelous group of people, wonderful smiles on each of these faces, and all of you.